Okay, so now we enter the second, and quite frankly, I think more exciting part of the course, because we've now gotten the fundamentals behind us. In a different world, we could start the course right now. Or actually, I would incorporate a few of those first lectures. But this is a gen ed course. You're not expected to have prereqs. And therefore, I had to go over the basics that you need to understand paleontology. But now we're finally going to get to the good stuff. So, it's a course about dinosaurs. I could potentially start right at dinosaurs. That doesn't make any sense because it doesn't give you the context. But, where do I start? Do I do the entire history of the Earth? No, that's going to take too long. I've got another course where I do that anyway, so it's GL 102 if you're ever interested. Or do I start with the origin of life? Or do I start with the origin of vertebrates? There's lots of places I could start. And I decided really a good place to start would be the colonization of land. Particularly the colonization of land by vertebrates, by animals with a backbone. It's an important event in the history of life. It's one that's been parodied in lots of cartoons. Here's one from the cartoon History of the Universe. And it's by the Devonian. We'll talk about what the Devonian is in a bit, but it's sort of the middle of the Paleozoic. Plants had covered the lands, and the animals followed. First came the bugs, and then the fish. I will be the first on land. But here the bugs are already there. Don't worry, they won't get the credit. Why not? Because my descendants will write the book, as indeed we did. So if we looked at the whole scope of Earth history, the Earth formed at about 4.56 billion years ago, or 4,560 million years ago. An immense amount of time. Life seems to have originated before 4 billion years or so, although it's hard to say. For one thing, we don't have a geologic record back then, before 4.03 billion. But there are arguments to be made for that. We have definite traces of life by about 3.8 billion. We have cells with a nucleus by about 2.5 billion years ago, 2,500 million. So before that, life would have been the same level that we would have today in archaeans and bacteria. Animals themselves, so this multicellular group of organisms to which we and the dinosaurs and others belong, show up somewhere about 630 to 700 million years ago, depending upon the level of evidence. But to be fair, the oldest animals are not sort of creatures that are ever featured on Animal Planet, because sort of first animals would be things like sponges, and then things like sea anemones, or that sort of level. They're animals technically, but they're not the sort of animals that most of us think about. Yeah, question?
That's the Cambrian explosion, right?
That's actually before the Cambrian explosion. Good call, good question though. So animals appear before the Cambrian explosion, but, so I've expanded out this upper part here. So there's the Paleozoic, the Mesozoic, and the Cenozoic. So all this is what we call the Precambrian. So there's today. Oh, I thought I had a notation of it. The base of the Cambrian, or at least around the base of the Cambrian, is what's called the Cambrian explosion. And it involves the appearance of animals with a skeleton. Not a bony skeleton yet, but shells. Prior to that, animals didn't have typically an external covering, and that makes them very difficult to find in the fossil record, because remember, one of the things that increases your chance of getting into the fossil record is having a skeleton, shells. But starting around then, over the course of a few millions of years, so it's an explosion that takes millions of years to happen, we get lots of different, diverse sorts of animals developing shells. And then that makes the fossil record easier to read. Also because of that, because we now have fossils that are abundant and widespread and recognizable to the naked eye, it was easier for geologists early on to subdivide that time into smaller units, and so it subdivided up. And so here we have a look at what we call the Phanerozoic eons, so the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. So here, the age of dinosaurs exists between the late Triassic and the end of the Cretaceous. So you see, where this is, that would just be up in here. So really, the age of dinosaurs is geologically recent. Most of Earth history had already passed. the oldest vertebrates, the oldest animals with an internal skeleton. Fish, but only fish in only the broadest sense of the term. Things of the level of organization of a hagfish or a lamprey. They show up by the mid-Cambrian. And the story we're going to get to today starts with the colonization of land here between what's called the Silurian and Devonian period, although actually this whole colonization continues into the Carboniferous. And then we'll continue on to the end of the Permian with today's lecture. So we're going to start in the late Devonian at about 370 million years ago. Here's a reconstruction of what the Earth might have looked like at the time. Remember, the continents are moving throughout Earth history. And at this point, let's just see, this part of this landmass is North America and Greenland. Maryland would be down here. So in the southern hemisphere, facing south. So our current east coast was a south coast. And this wrinkled landmass here, those are the Appalachians, an early phase of the Appalachians. The Appalachians are a quite old mountain range. Over here, this is Western and Central Europe, just to give you a sense. The two of them smashed together in a collision before this, which produced a mountain range, which, among other things, for people of your generation, you've mostly seen that mountain range if you've seen Harry Potter movies, because the mountains of Scotland formed as part of this event, as also the mountains of Greenland. This would be much of the rest of Asia. Down here would be South America, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, and bits of that largely India, and then these fragments eventually slam in to become southern Central Asia. Just to give you a sense. So at this point, the Earth is already more than 4 billion years old. Most of Earth history has already happened at that point. Life is already 3.5 billion years old. And potentially older. And life in the oceans was already extremely diverse. By the late Devonian, you probably, if you went snorkeling back then, or scuba diving, you would see comparable levels of diversity as you might in the different marine ecosystems of today. So just to give you an example, this is actually older than the Devonian. This is, I think, supposed to be the Ordovician. We see lots of things like trilobites, little scuttly arthropods, basically sea bugs. We see nautiloids and so forth. We see lots of crinoids, sea lilies. And here we go a little later. So this is supposed to be, I think, the Silurian. And we're getting more advanced fish. So members of the vertebrate group, these are fish with bones, but they're not bony fish. What do I mean by that? You were probably told in a biology class, because in the modern world it's true, that vertebrates are distinguished from other animals by having a bony endoskeleton, a bony internal skeleton. And that's true eventually. The bone initially evolved as an exoskeleton. The early members of the vertebrates had a bony shell on the outside and bony scale armor on their bodies. And the internal skeleton was cartilage. The internal skeleton of early branches of vertebrates today are still cartilage. Hagfish, lampreys, and sharks, although sharks also modify that cartilage. They put a little calcite over it, so it's hard cartilage. Also at this point, the fish don't have jaws. They're jawless fish. And there's this big radiation of jawless fish at the time. And then we get to the Devonian, and there's a huge diversification of the type of fish. And indeed, when people talk about sort of nicknames of Earth history, the Devonian period is often called the Age of Fishes. Because if you use sort of the old-fashioned Linnaean systematics, there are more classes of fish and more orders of fish at this point than there are many points later in Earth history. Many of the early branches are still around, but the specialized derived branches have also arrived. So by the Devonian, we have jawless fish like lampreys and hagfish. We have armored jawless fish. We have armored jawed fish, but those jaws don't yet have teeth. We have armored jawed toothed fish. We have sharks, which aren't so armored, but definitely have teeth and jaws. We have early ray-finned fish, which is the group of fish that dominates the world today. So if you think of any fish today and it's not a shark or a ray, which is actually a type of shark, it's probably a ray-finned fish. And we've got lungfish, and we've got other sorts as well. So a huge diversity. There's a coelacanth in blue right in the center, a group that still exists today at far less diversity than they used to. So swimming side by side, you've got things like lungfish and jawless armored fish and jawed but toothless armored fish and so forth. As the cartoon said before, the plants and the bugs, that is arthropods, had already colonized the land and developed primitive terrestrial communities. Most of these communities were still hanging along the shoreline because life on land, as I'll talk about in a bit, is challenging. Life arose in the oceans. It colonized the fresh water, which itself is a challenging environment. And then from primarily the fresh water, although sometimes maybe directly from the sea, life came onto land. And as it came onto land, different types of living things had to evolve adaptations to survive. Yes?
So now that you mentioned adaptations, what kind of adaptations would, let's say, plants need to colonize freshwater? Because I know, like, for arthropods and stuff, they would need to find a way to filter out. They would need to find a way to deal with, less salt in their environment.
Right. Plants, too. Plants, as they colonize freshwater, have to do with this osmoregulation, which is the fancy way of dealing with salt. So they also had to deal with the fact that maybe the way you propagate yourself is going to be different if you live in a constrained channel rather than in the floating in the open ocean. And there are a few other things, although to be fair, of course, with all these groups, it's the colonization onto land that requires even more transformations, and I'll get to those. So, one of the nice things as plants colonize the land is they actually modified the landscape in all sorts of ways that fundamentally altered both the freshwater and the terrestrial environment. In terms of the freshwater environments, so what we see here are organisms first making their way into basically estuaries, into the bays, and then moving their way up the stream channel, which is that blue strip. As plants begin to colonize the land, they stabilize the riverbanks. And now we begin to get more permanent channels and clearer water. If you go to an area where there's not a lot of land plants around and the rivers are just, the technical term is braiding or anastomosing, breaking apart and coming together, you can see the water's often very cloudy. But when you've got plants colonizing the land, which is the vast majority of places in the world today, the water's often very clear. So that's changed the situation. The dead bodies of plants provide a food source for aquatic organisms. And when you've got roots and logs and so forth in the streams, they provide a habitat. So the plants are doing well on land. They're beginning to diversify. Eventually they're evolving things like seeds and wood. And they're allowing, first, a freshwater community to develop among arthropods, among vertebrates, among snails, and so forth, all the sort of creatures we could think of in freshwater communities. And among the fish that colonize is a group that would eventually be called, it's an ugly name, I know, but it gets the point across, tetrapodomorpha, the four-legged forms. So tetrapoda, as we'll see, are the terrestrial vertebrates of today, the amphibians and the amnions. Tetrapodomorpha are basically the tetrapods and everything closer to them than to lungfish. But the early ones of these, the early tetrapodomorphs would be fish. I mean, they're creatures that live in the water the vast majority of time. They breathe in the water. They move around in the water. They breed in the water. But they're somewhat better on land than other fish. Now, an aside, one of the cool things, actually no, I'll have a slide where I talk about that, never mind. So here is an early tetrapodomorph. Here we see another one. One advantage of the tetrapodomorph body style is they have these four powerful fins. They've lost the dorsal fin. They lost the fin on the back. They've lost any ventral fins, any fins along the bottom. But they've got one pair in front, the pectoral fins, which are still attached to the back of the head, as they are in most fish. And they've got the pelvic fins. And if the environment dries up, like a pond dries up, which ponds can dry up, the ocean typically doesn't, They could go from one pond to another over land, sort of swimming along the land, in ways that some of the other fish of their environment might not. Even in the modern world, there are plenty of ray-finned fish that do this. Things like snakeheads, mud skippers, even some eels. We don't think about this, but some eels actually can go from pond to pond over land. And here's another one. Oh, this is Elpistostega, not Pandaricus. That name should have gone away. And it's beginning to get this new body plan. Also because it lives in the shallows so much, its head is very flat. Very much like an alligator head, actually. And it's from these fish that we eventually get ones that live much more of their life cycle on land. Now, coming onto land has difficulties for all sorts of organisms. For one thing, and I know this is going to come as a surprise to hopefully no one, the air is drier than the water. And so you risk something that can't happen in the water, which is desiccation. You can dry out on land. So you need something to cover your body. In the case of plants, they had to evolve waxy tissue. It's the reason that algae feels slimy, but land plants typically don't, because they've evolved this waxy tissue. In the case of arthropods, they already had something. They had cuticle. So bugs already had the exoskeleton. Fish had scales, that helps, and sometimes they would have mucus on the body. Respiration. Aquatic organisms get their oxygen from the dissolved oxygen in the water. You can't do that in the air, at least not using the same equipment. But it turned out, as fish had colonized the freshwater, they tended to evolve an important new adaptation, which is lungs. Now, there is a subgroup of fish that are called lungfish, but they're not the only fish with lungs. In fact, all bony fish ancestrally have lungs, and primitive bony fish today still do. It's sort of a backup system. They mostly use their gills, but because freshwater can go anoxic in the way the ocean rarely does. Think about it, a pond, a lake, there's not necessarily a lot of flowing water there. If you get algal blooms, it can go anoxic. These things can gulp air. And in fact, some do gulp air today. If you have a pet goldfish, or koi, if you've got the bigger ones, same animal, they're gulping air because they need extra oxygen because their water isn't so oxygenated. They're fine with that. That's how they live. And so this specialized structure, which is actually an outpouching of the gut initially, becomes better and better in some of the fish. And then the tetrapodomorph fish, it was pretty good. Reproduction. Most organisms in the water, when they reproduce, the males and females don't even have to be in the same place at the same time in order to reproduce. They send out clouds of sperm and clouds of eggs into the water. Now, many of them do try to time things so it works out, and it always works better if you're close to each other in order to get your eggs fertilized and maybe even have some choice over who's doing the fertilization. But still, you don't actually have to be in physical contact in order to reproduce. That strategy doesn't work too well in the air. But it's not like all these issues get solved simultaneously. And there are plenty of land vertebrates, at least as adults, that still have to reproduce in the water. Hence, I'm wearing my frog tie today. So the vertebrates did not initially solve this. For that matter, neither did the arthropods nor the plants. In all three groups, they actually remained reproducing in the water in the early forms, and then derived forms later on find ways to do without it. Support against gravity. Here's another thing that most of us is not going to come as a shock to. Water buoys you up. It's the reason that ponds and going out to swimming pools and so forth is cool. You're floating around. Air, not so much. And so any organism that lives and spends much time on land has to have some sort of support against gravity. The bugs were already well equipped for that. The exoskeleton they had works pretty well on land. Plants had to evolve specialized material, lignin, to help support them. And in fact, very primitive plants today that lack that, they don't grow very tall at all. Vertebrates, we already had something in our ancestry. We had an internal skeleton of bone, something that evolved for life in the water. But because it existed, it could work as a support against gravity. And then, for obtaining food, that had to change. A very common mode of life among water animals is what's called suspension feeding. It is by far the dominant mode of life of most type of animals. And that's basically sitting around, or sometimes swimming around, opening your mouth or whatever organ you use to catch food, and capturing small particles of food that go by. Works well for most creatures in the water. The air tends not to be filled with hamburgers or salads or whatever, and so that mode of life doesn't work too well on land. So you actually have to get pieces of food and ingest them. And in the case of both the arthropods and the vertebrates, there's a special challenge. Because if you've got particles of food in the water and you want to eat it, you just reorient your body and go after it. But say you are a fish, and you have your arms, or your shoulders are part of your skull, as they are ancestrally. And there's a particle of food you want to eat on land, you go, ah, because you can't reach it. Because your head and your arms are connected. Because they don't have necks. Think about that next time you draw a fish. There's no neck on a fish. Same thing with many arthropods. They don't have necks in the water. Because all they have to do is swim and reorient themselves. So both the ancestors of the insects and the ancestors of the land vertebrates had to do something and evolved basically a neck convergently. In the case of the vertebrates, all you have to do is detach the shoulder bones, the pectoral girdle, from the skull, and then you now have a neck. And that's indeed what happened. Also, in the case of animals, not so much plants, but animals, moving around on land is going to be a little different than the water. Although you start with what you got. And your senses work somewhat differently. I think most of us know sound travels much more easily in the water. You can hear things from much further away in the water. In fact, it sounds really weird when we're in the water. Happened for these guys too. Sound doesn't conduct in the air as well. Sight, not too much difference. Smell, well, you got to be able to pick up the scent on the air. The pressure sense, pressure sense. You guys don't think there are only 5 senses, do you? No, that's a stupid exaggeration. And even for we humans, we have senses other than just those 5 ones. But a very common sense in the water is pressure sense. It's not quite touch. It's sort of an underwater radar, where you feel the pressure waves going against you. It's related to touch, but it's not the same thing, yeah.
Don't fish have a lateral line that allows them to pick up?
Exactly. So the pressure sense of fish is this lateral line system, and as waves of water go past it, they go, oh, there's something coming at me from over there. Also, some fish have the electric sense, which we don't have anymore. Why? Because, A, the pressure sense isn't going to work in air, because air is not dense enough to transmit those waves, and the electric sense doesn't work in air, because air is the opposite of an insulator. It's an insulator. So those senses had to go away, and hearing had to be modified. But this did get modified in some early members of the fish. So here we have one of these tetrapodomorphs, where it's not quite separated yet, but mostly getting separated. The shoulder from the skull. And look at the fins. These are the bones down the fin. These sort of fish have a single bone that connects with either the pectoral girdle or the pelvic girdle, and then a joint where 2 bones come out of that. And then a collection of smaller bones, and then a series of other bones running down. And that should sound familiar. This is the early incarnation of the land vertebrate forelimb. A humerus, a radius and ulna, so an elbow between them, a wrist, and ultimately the things that will become fingers and toes. Now this evolved in an aquatic context. If you live in an environment with choked vegetation, pushing yourself through that vegetation with your fin is useful. There are ray-finned fish that evolved something analogous to this today that live in things like high-energy environments or in coral reefs and so forth. Plus, if you got to push yourself around on the land, this works even better than not having this. And we see variations on this body form in the Devonian. And it's from animals like this, from fish like this, fish with wrists, fish with elbows, fish with shoulders, that we evolved a group called the Stegocephalians. The Stegocephalians are tetrapodomorphs that take it one step further they have fingers and toes. That is, what used to be rays of cartilage in the fin are now modified so that they've got bone in them. However, they had lots of fingers and toes. And just to show you, this would have been a fish. It lived mostly in the water. It would have had nice pink gills under that skull. You open that up, you would go back fishing, you lift it up, you flip that open, you would have gills like a trout would today. But it's a finger fish. It's a fish with digits. And it's not the only one. Incidentally, in the early days, there were lots of fingers and toes. So here we see on Acanthostega, we can do a count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then the toe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And some of these guys have 8 fingers and toes. It hadn't been solidified down yet. So lots of traits were already present in vertebrates before they began to be primarily terrestrial that would help them. An internal bony skeleton to support weight, lungs to breathe air, scales and mucus on the body to prevent desiccation, and bony limbs with wrists and ankles and digits to help crawl around. Remember that evolutionary pattern of exaptation, of traits that were already present, that get co-opted, they get used in a new fashion. All of these were traits that got exapted to life on land, but were originally evolved in an aquatic context. And that's what I just said. Exaptation from life on land, because originally evolved for an aquatic context. So now we've made our way to the Devonian period. Sorry, to the Carboniferous period. We have left the Devonian, made our way to the Carboniferous period. And here we have all the land masses are beginning to slam together to form a supercontinent. Oh, I should point out, it's actually a time period that's cold as far as the Earth goes. And in fact, there's an ice age that goes on throughout the Carboniferous, with the ice concentrated in the southern continents. There's not land at the North Pole, and therefore you don't get these huge glaciers forming there. The Carboniferous means coal-bearing period. And it's during this period that much of the coal that we mine today formed. And remember, coal is plant matter that gets deposited faster than it can be decayed. And in fact, the environment in which these form are what are called the coal swamps. Low-lying, so close to the sea level, environments filled with lots of plants. Comparable in size to modern trees, but not closely related to the modern groups that form trees today. Some were. There were some ferns, tree ferns. We still have tree ferns today. But many of these are closely related to things we call club mosses and horsetails and so forth, but at the size of a giant tree. It's in the coal swamps that the insects first arise. Insects, the first animals to break with gravity with the evolution of wings. And famously in the Carboniferous and in the following Permian period, there were giant insects. So this griffin fly, it's an extinct cousin of the dragonflies, is eating a cockroach comparable to a normal-sized cockroach. That is not a micro cockroach. This is an insect with a wingspan of about 2.5 feet. One of the largest insects of all Earth history. And the largest herbivores in the early part of the Carboniferous weren't vertebrates, which were mostly tiny. They were millipedes as long as a cow. I'd call them Godzillapedes, but that's not the technical name. But in this Carboniferous period, we get the rise of the true tetrapoda, the 4-footed ones, the terrestrial vertebrates with 5 fingers and 5 toes, and the complete neck. And there's other features that diagnose the tetrapods as well. Now, early tetrapods still reproduce in the water. So they are amphibians. But today, when we talk about the word amphibia, we often think of that as the group that includes frogs, salamanders, toads, newts, and caecilians, if you happen to know about caecilians, or these legless amphibians. They're pretty funky. Those do probably, if you take 431, you'll hear maybe not, but probably form a monophyletic group. But most of the early tetrapods would have been amphibian in the sense that they laid eggs in the water but they lived at least some of their life on land unless they evolved to stay in the water. So an amphibian is a unique creature that is sexually attracted to... No, that's not what they are. Amphibians, however, used to be extremely diverse. I mean, they're still pretty diverse today, but in the late Paleozoic, they're super diverse. And they move on land essentially by land swimming. They're still doing the same motions as swimming, but now they've got legs with elbows and knees and wrists and fingers and toes, and so they can move around pretty well. And of course, eventually, some forms of all things like hopping, but that came on later. The amphibians of the Paleozoic were often much larger than the amphibians of today, although there were tiny ones as well. And they were very diverse. And I'm just going to show you some bits of their diversity here. There are things like the boomerang heads. During ontogeny, the sides of their skull grow out to these big boomerangs, although it may be, unlike these illustrations show, that there was actually skin that attached from the back of the skull to the body. These ones were mostly aquatic. They didn't come out on land very much at all. Others could have been on land at least some of the time, but were sort of amphibian crocodiles or amphibian alligators. And as shown here, this is about life size. This is a big individual of Uriops. So a good-sized animal. A fish eater, also probably ate other amphibians. I like this picture of it. They made sure not to give it claws. Some of these amphibians still breathe through gills throughout their entire life cycle, unlike the modern amphibians. Modern amphibians, by and large, breathe out through their skin. They breathe in through their mouth and out through their skin. It's really weird. But that didn't happen with these forms. These things, many of them were still scaly. Today we don't have scaled amphibians. Well, it's not much. Not like this. These are true fish scales on these forms. So don't think of these as frogs or salamanders or newts. They're not. And that's a nice reconstruction of this particular form. Some were quite large. Some of these are as big as an alligator, or big as a crocodile, or some of them actually even bigger than modern crocodiles. And some of them actually lived in the open seas. That's totally different than the modern world. Today, because they breathe through their skins, if you take an amphibian and you throw them in salt water, I will hurt you. No, because it would hurt the animal, and that's a mean thing to do to an amphibian. They can't tolerate salt water, so it's not their thing. Don't do that. But in the past, these things aren't breathing through their skins. They've got scales and so forth. They can handle salt water. That's not to say that they were all entirely different than the modern amphibians. We get the ancestors of frogs and salamanders during the Permian, which is the last period of the Paleozoic. This is Gyrobatrachus, the frogamander. So it's close to the common ancestry of frogs and salamanders. And the name both means grandfather of the frogs. Gero, in that context, like geriatrics. But one of the guys who named this creature, the team, has a Japanese ancestry. And in Japan, the sound that frogs make, that we say ribbit, ribbit in English, is gero, gero, gero. So it's also the ribbit frog. You can do fun things like that in taxonomy. And some of these amphibian-grade animals were actually really good at moving around on land. This thing, look at those legs there, nice, good neck, strong skull. This is a terrestrial animal. It's actually a predaceous animal, eating other land vertebrates. Not all of them, though. This is actually a Triassic one rather than late Paleozoic. This is one of the forms they call a toilet bowl head. The skull sizes are about the same size as a toilet bowl lid, but you wouldn't want to sit on it because it's got teeth. And I like this illustration of it. So all these forms have aquatic, tadpole-like larvae, even if they, through ontogeny, become terrestrial adults. And that's a way of life that actually works pretty well. We have thousands of species of living frogs. So it's not a huge hindrance, but wouldn't it be nice if when the breeding season comes, you didn't have to go back to the pond, and you didn't have to spend several weeks or months of your life as a tadpole breathing water and waiting to metamorphose for life on land. And so the full conquest of land by the vertebrates required a transformation to a self-contained land egg. Now we have creatures that are near that transition, and to be fair, we can't say for certain if this animal and its close relatives laid eggs on land or not. We've never found the actual eggs. Phylogenetically, it lies outside the group of modern egg layers. But just because it does that, this is in that sort of zone of uncertainty in terms of evolutionary transition. Maybe it evolved the shelled egg, maybe it reproduced in the water, we don't know. But its pectoral girdles, its pelvic girdles, its front limbs, its hind limbs, and so forth are all good enough that it and its relatives was really good about moving around on land. There's a recent study where they did both a CG version of it and an actual robot of it, and made sure that it could actually fit the footprints they thought came from it, which it does. Here's another form of about that grade. And in fact, at this level, we're getting among the first terrestrial herbivores, animals that chomp up plants, land plants, for food. Think about that. Have you ever seen a frog eat a plant? Have you ever seen a salamander munch on salad? No. They're flesh eaters, or at least insect eaters and so forth. And many of the early vertebrates were these flesh eaters or fish eaters, whatever. But here we got one that chomps up plants. And shown there, bigger than life size, but this is a good sized animal. It's at least as long as, this table here, and even a little longer than that, maybe up to 2 meters or so. And it's from forms like these last few I've been showing you, that we get the rise of amniota, the fully terrestrial vertebrates, the ones that make the breakthrough to become terrestrial throughout their entire life cycle. So here we have in the coal swamp an early amniote celebrating its liberation from the water by chasing a bug. And here's some that are being less dramatic, but still hanging around on land. So the name amniota refers to one of the major adaptations that characterizes this group, an amniotic egg. We call these shelled eggs because that's one of the characteristic features. Now the shell in most amniotic eggs is not the crispy shell we see in birds, but rather the leathery shell we see in things like lizards and snakes, most turtles. We also see that leathery shell in the egg-laying mammals of today, because there still are a couple egg-laying mammals. But it's more than that. The name itself is derived from the amnion. This is a sac that forms a pond, a liquid pond, in which the embryo grows. So the joke is that the amniotes don't lay their eggs in the pond, they lay their pond in the eggs. Even placental and marsupial mammals retain the amnion. It's the thing when her water breaks, that's it. That's the tissue that holds the water, that's actually more than water, the amniotic fluid in which the embryo develops. Amniotic eggs also still have a yolk, but that's ancestral. Even fish eggs have yolk. And they've got waste disposal systems and more, but it's a contained structure that can be laid on land. In fact, it has to be laid on land. An amniotic egg, if you immerse it in water, will drown the embryo. It allows gases to pass through, so it breathes, but still it protects the embryo until it can hatch out and move around on land. But of course, because it's a shelled egg, fertilization can't happen outside the body. Because how would the sperm get through the shell? And so, amniotes have to do it. They have to do it internally. That is, they have to have some form of internal fertilization, traditionally by some form of penis. So, because the egg has to be fertilized before the shell develops on the outside. There's more traits than that. The skin of land vertebrates, our skin and the skin of sauropsids, that is reptiles, is keratinized. We have a lot of keratin in our skin. Our fingers have fingernails, that is claws. And the keratinized skin is our defense against desiccation. But the claws help us dig. And why do we need to dig? Because ancestrally, that's where you lay your eggs. You dig a hole, you lay your eggs in them, you cover them up, and then go off and do your own thing. Plus, if you've got claws, you can do a lot more with them, like turn them into killing weapons, or things used to get plant food, or hooves eventually, or whatever. We have traces of the scaly body very early in the history of vertebrates. The scales of amniotes are different than the scales of fish. They are not homologous to fish scales. They're actually a brand new structure, a modification of this keratinized integument. And here's some wonderfully preserved Permian forms that show the scales way back then, keratin scales. Now, among the amniotes, most have some form of temporal fenestrae. Remember I talked before about the supratemporal, the ones on top, and the infratemporal, the ones on side, fenestrae? They're to house these jaw muscles, and you can see the jaw muscles shown as these cylinders. And the idea is, when a muscle contracts, it retains the same volume, so it has to expand. To get really powerful jaw muscles, they can't expand all the way to the middle, because there needs to be a space for a brain. And so by knocking holes on the outside, when they expand, the muscles can bulge outwards. And if you see a very powerful jawed animal, like if you hang around horses and they're eating, you can see where their temporal fenestrae are. You can see the muscles bulging there. Now, there are three basic patterns we see of skull form. There are forms that don't have any temporal fenestrae, which is called the synapsid condition, without branches is what it means. And technically speaking, an synapsid condition would be ancestral, but it looks, in our modern understanding of amniote relationships, that the amniotes within an synapsid skull actually is a reversal. And instead, that the early branches of amniotes tend to be either synapsid, which has the infratemporal or lateral temporal fenestra only, the side one, or diapsid. That is both the supra and the lateral temporal fenestra. So there's where we got the lateral temporal fenestra, and diapsids have both. This remains a little contentious part of amniote phylogenetics, but the recent studies do kind of point to the amniotes that have an synapsid skull being a reversal, maybe. Now, in the modern world, we only have synapsids and diapsids. The forms that have synapsid skulls have died out. And the basic relationships, or as a version of a basic relationship here, is that the group that contains mammals, which is Synapsida, branched off before the cluster of other forms. Those are the sauropsids, or what we used to call traditionally reptiles. So the living sauropsids are the turtles, the lizards and snakes, the crocodilians, and the birds. Those are the living diapsids, which are a type of sauropsid. The living synapsids are the mammals. But nothing in the modern world looks like a late Paleozoic or even an early Mesozoic amniote. And, not surprisingly, both major groups, the sauropsids and the synapsids, show up at the same time, as indeed we would predict. In the video, the online video I recorded, we can infer minimum divergence time, and in this case, we actually have fossils from both that go back to about the same age. So you don't have to memorize this, but this is in the lecture notes. This looks at the relationships of modern and extinct synapsids and sauropsids, and some of the major transformations. Now, we might think, synapsids, they include mammals. Diapsids include dinosaurs. Mammals dominate now, diapsid dominated before us, therefore the diapsids were the first group to rule, but that would be backwards. In fact, the first group of amniotes to dominate the ecosystem were us, the synapsids, our distant ancestors. And during the late Paleozoic, the dinosaurs' ancestors, the diapsids, were a minor group, and they were in the shadow of the synapsids. So the first big radiation, adaptive radiation of the vertebrates, of the amniotes, was a synapsid radiation. And that begins in the mid-Carboniferous, or late Carboniferous, I should say. So here is the Permian, which follows the Carboniferous. All the land masses of the world are essentially connected. Some parts of China aren't connected yet, but otherwise it's all together as a supercontinent called Pangaea. And this first amniotic radiation is one dominated by the early branches, what we call the basal members of the synapsids. And this goes from the late Carboniferous into the early parts of the Permian. So here we see the classic basal synapsid Dimetrodon attacking a shark, but the shark is fighting back. It's a freshwater shark. And then various amphibian-grade animals in the water. These early communities, these basal synapsid communities, in fact, were still tied into the water. There were some terrestrial herbivores, but they were still relatively rare. Most of the food comes out of the fresh water, even if the amniotes were living their whole life cycle on land. Again, these basal synapsids, they've got that infratemporal fenestra. We also have evidence of parental care among them. Mammals, of course, are famous for having parental care, but even in the Permian, we have evidence of an adult in red in the drawing below, and at least 1, 2, 3, 4 young individuals that were all found in a burrow together. And so it looks like the mammalian trait of looking after your young goes way back in our ancestry, well before the origin of mammals. Some early basal synapsids, this is a generic one, this is mostly a fish eater. There's a life reconstruction of it munching on a lungfish. Shown about life size, actually, as I project here. Some were herbivores. Look at the tiny little skull. That skull belongs to this individual. Dinky little skull compared to this body. This animal, as people point out, look at the size of the hand compared to its skull. This thing's face palm would cover its whole hands. Its whole head there. So here's an example. Well, it's shown about life size. It's projected here. Some got even bigger. Many of the basal synapsids have these really tall neural spines, or sails. Now, these weren't for sailing out in the open sea or anything like that. They probably had multiple functions. One of the functions was probably for display, to show off, hey, baby, I'm a male adaptations, or whatever. But it also probably had a solar panel function. In fact, it would be hard for it not to. This tall structure could capture a lot of sunlight. It's a huge surface area without much volume. And that's very good for collecting sunlight and getting the body warm. And that's useful because these creatures are all still cold-blooded. And by cold-blooded, we mean they get their energy from the outside environment. So in order to get active, you need to heat up. And if you've got a great big sail, you heat up before everyone else in your environment. At least until through coevolution, and I'll finish with this guy. There'll be a couple slides with them. Some of the predators evolved the great big sail too, and they can start chasing after you. So Dimetrodon, the classic and most advanced of the basal synapsids with this great big sail, a predator, one of the first apex predators on land. Not a dinosaur. It's actually closer to us than it is to dinosaurs. And in this form, we begin to see a trait that's going to be important in later parts of synapsid history, and that is the teeth in the front of the jaw have different shapes than the teeth in the back of the jaw. And just to wrap it up with a couple more pictures, because Dimetrodon is cool and everyone loves it. But it is not a real dinosaur, although it is in almost every pack of toy dinosaurs out there. So we'll pick up next time with the late Permian, and as the basal synapsids evolved themselves out of existence. And then we'll go to the greatest mass extinction in Earth history and the rise of the age of reptiles. And on Wednesday, we'll get the dinosaurs. All right.